Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, Frank, and good evening to those of you for whom that is your current time zone. Welcome to this event hosted by Transparency International UK, a discussion on enablers, how the West supports corruption and its effect on our democracy. I'm very pleased that we're able to bring you this event this afternoon with the kind sponsorship of Exeter, to whom we are grateful for their support, both for our work and in our own due diligence requirements. So thank you to our sponsors. I can't express how excited I am to be able to introduce you today to Frank Vogl. Frank is a co-founder not only of Transparency International, but also of the Partnership for Transparency Fund, where he is chair of the board. I think I first met Frank a little over 4 years ago, and he made quite an impression on me, as I'm sure he will on you today. There were two things that I recall from that first meeting. The first was impressing upon us the importance, as those of us who work on anti-corruption, of always asking what our efforts are doing for the victims of corruption. And that thought is very much front of mind in the work that my colleague Rachel Davies Teka, who you'll hear from later, does in our team on asset recovery and its accountable return from the West, and certainly from places like London in the UK. And the other key point that Frank was trying to impress upon us even then was the importance that we should hold ourselves accountable, hold all those in our own countries in the West accountable for their role in the world's corruption woes. For 30 years or more, Western companies, and indeed those that might consider themselves professionals from our financial services and related industries, have facilitated the asset stripping of the bloated post-Soviet states. And whilst they have grown rich from this activity, they haven't done it just for their own ends, but it's a process that has been serving the personal enrichment of those countries' kleptocratic leaders and their cronies and associates. And a consequence of all of this is an astounding amount of wealth which has made its way onto our shores. And this isn't just a matter of shame to us. It's not just a very vivid depiction of inequality in our own societies. It's not just an extra element of the housing crisis that we suffer in places like London. But it is also something which has enabled these oligarchs and others to have an outsized influence in our society and our democracy. And so when we see events like we have at the moment of the tensions over the security of Ukraine, and question marks about what we can do to prevent further invasion of that country from Russia, we quickly turn our attention to the assets and the interests of what are clearly hostile actors here in our own country and our own society. And so there couldn't be a more timely moment, I think, for this discussion or for Frank's book, The Enablers, which he will be talking to us about today. Frank will take us through some of the main findings of his book, How the West Supports Kleptocrats and Corruption, Endangering Our Democracy, before our very own head of advocacy, Rachel Davies Teka, will put some questions to Frank about what it means for the UK and our relationship with our allies. So with no further ado, over to you, Frank.
Your colleagues at TI UK, I followed the work of TIUK, really since the very start of the chapter. And you've been real leaders, not only in the UK, but internationally. So it's a great privilege for me to be with you today and to talk about my book. My book names names. It takes the reader through some of the worst money laundering scams of the biggest banks to the blind regulators, the people who should be monitoring the illicit money but seem to be asleep at the wheel. The book goes to the property deals, to the art industry opacity, to the pathetic public apologies by auditors, by management consultants, by the armies of lobbyists, public relations people who basically sell their services to the highest bidder, irrespective of who those bidders really are. They don't care. In many cases, they're criminals. So I then turn from that to the staggering sums of cash supplied through the bond markets to governments run by kleptocrats, and then on to corruption in natural resources and in the arms industry. Let me start our discussion by just reading the very first paragraph of my book, The Enablers, as Duncan mentioned. And it starts, across the world, leaders of authoritarian governments and their cronies are robbing their people. These leaders are kleptocrats, and they're pocketing staggering sums of cash, which they move through the world's financial system into investments in the wealthiest nations. These crimes perpetrated by kleptocrats governing Russia, China, Iran, Egypt, Hungary, Nigeria, and many more countries not only impoverish their own citizens, but all of us. More gallingly, we are assisting them in their greed and their grand corruption. Even more worrying, we are complicit in their quest for greater power. And what I'm trying to say in this book is corruption is a universal problem. It's not just a question of the poor countries or the former Soviet countries having authoritarian leaders. Corruption is pervasive. We are all in it together. And right at the center of the whole system today are the bankers, the auditors, the management consultants, the art dealers, the real estate brokers, the yacht brokers, and armies of consultants. These are the enablers. They aid and abet the illicit flow of staggering amounts of money across the world into safe, secure, and mostly secret investments in Western markets. Now, I wrote this book as an advocate. I want people to read this and then feel that we all together, all of us must do far, far more to counter the activities of the enablers and our own governments that are complicit in this global corruption system. Now, first of all, had my publisher allowed me to have an even longer subtitle to the book, and it's pretty long as it is, it would have read how the West supports kleptocrats and corruption, endangering our democracy and national security. We can't just look at corruption in isolation. We have to tie it to the fate of democracy itself. And what we've seen in the last 15 years is the rise of authoritarianism around the world and the increasing fragility of democracy itself across the West. And with the Russian troops now on the borders of Ukraine, we can also see how closely the strength of a kleptocratic regime that uses the London and American financial markets to strengthen its own wealth and power, how that regime is now at its core threatening the national security of all of us, of all nations, in what may be the most dangerous moment since World War II, certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I wrote this book to condemn the complicity of silence by Western governments, the UK government, the American government, the EU governments. What do I mean by the complicity of silence? Oh, sure, we have the wonderful speeches and rhetoric of national leaders against corruption. But the complicity of silence goes to the core of enforcement. We have anti-corruption laws, we have anti-money laundering laws, but they're not being enforced. And so long as that's the case, then we see the complicity. And let me just read to you a paragraph from the Financial Times of this Monday. It's an article written by Peter Hain, who many of you in the UK know. And he wrote, and I quote, "Investigators require proper resourcing. You never get it. In the UK in 2019, the head of the National Crime Agency requested an additional £2.7 billion in funding for law enforcement. Not granted. Governments the world over talk the talk on corruption, but have so far refused to take the necessary tough action against corporations to stop enabling it." Peter Hain could have been reading my book, because this is one of the core things. If we don't enforce the law, it's meaningless. Forget the nice rhetoric. So we have to go after the governments that are willing to support the enablers. And I'll come back to that point. We have to understand that the total amount of foreign aid and foreign direct investment that goes into sub-Saharan Africa each year is matched by the total amount of illegal money, the dirty money that comes out of sub-Saharan Africa. This is a desperate situation that impoverishes tens of millions of Africans. We have to be concerned about that. Our governments are not adequately concerned. We have to be concerned that right now, in the City of London, people are trading in the stock on the London Stock Exchange of Gazprom, for example. They are also supporting the bond issues in pounds and yens and euros and dollars of Gazprom bonds. And at the same time, Gazprom, the largest state-controlled company in Russia, is using its natural gas supplies to Western Europe as a political club. How can we reconcile these financial dealings in the city with the way in which Gazprom operates politically? We have to ask ourselves, are the financial institutions at the core of the city, many of them, not all by any means, or on Wall Street or in other global financial centers, operating in our public interest? Are they operating to secure our national security, to secure our democracy, or in fact, aiding and abetting those who wish to undermine our democracy, undermine our elections, sow havoc amongst the NATO countries, steal our science and technology? These are very big questions. I try to address them in the book. Let me jump straight away to conclusions. First, I asked the banks themselves, can't you look at your own culture, which today is a culture driven solely by short-term profit maximization that leads to huge bonuses? It casts aside integrity. It casts aside serving our democracy. This culture has led to the Great Recession and financial crisis of a decade ago. It led to huge money laundering. It has led to tax evasion schemes. It has led to rigging of LIBOR and foreign exchange markets. We need to see cultural change, hopefully by the banks themselves. Secondly, if that isn't the case, we need to do administrative reforms. We need to have rules in place that are far more severe on due diligence, on know your customer, in banking, in real estate, in the art market, and wherever the dirty cash finds a home. We don't have anything like the standards that are needed if we really want to make a difference and push back against this massive money laundering that takes place. We need laws. Not a single chairman of a major global bank has been prosecuted because of all the money laundering on all the crimes their institutions have perpetrated. In fact, not a single chairman of a major bank has even lost his job because of these crimes. This is intolerable. Banks and other financial institutions are looking at the fines imposed on them simply as a cost of doing business. This is something that we shouldn't sit still and tolerate. We have to act. The final chapter of my book goes deeper and broader. Money in politics is the cancer of our political system. It has reached extraordinary limits. The top bankers, auditors, lawyers in the city who are operating as enablers are also incredibly politically networked. They know how to use their political influence to ensure minimal enforcement, to guard against the kinds of new rules and regulations that I think are essential. We need to change that, and we need to look at the core of our political systems in order to do that. It's a long challenge, a long march, but I think we can succeed. Thank you very much indeed. Over to you, Rich.
Thank you so much, Frank. I have lots of questions. Before I kick off, I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions for Frank, please do drop them into the Q&A box and we will start to bring those through shortly. Frank, in your talk, you mentioned rhetoric from world leaders. And in fact, in your book, you include a quote from Joe Biden, which I'm going to read, if that's okay. Fighting corruption is not just good governance, it is self-defense, and it's essential to the preservation of our democracy and our future. As someone who's lived in the US a long, long time, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on, how critical do you think the Biden administration is in terms of preventing enablers doing bad things? And also, do you think that the action we've seen so far from the US government measures up to that positive rhetoric?
I think the intentions are great. I think the Summit for Democracy that Joe Biden hosted in December was important as an initiative. I think the National Security Memorandum that came out last June, from which that quote is actually taken, was the first of its kind to link anti-corruption work directly to national security and democracy issues. And I think, as I tried to say in the book, and as I just tried to say a few minutes ago, that is key. But this administration is being, understandably perhaps, sidetracked. Ukraine, China, you name it. We've got crises on every front. And my big fear is that all of the good intentions of this administration will not translate into the kind of action that I believe is essential. And that means that all of us in civil society have a huge job to build on the initiatives of this administration and keep pushing them. It's going to be very, very tough.
Picking up on that point, actually, in terms of building on those initiatives, and you mentioned the Summit for Democracy, we had part 1 in December, part 2 will be at the end of 2022. And I think a lot of the people on this call are part of that global anti-corruption movement from different sectors. What do you think we can all be doing to leverage that summit, to try and make the most of it, to make sure that the commitments different countries make are actually followed through and implemented? Do you think that's an opportunity there?
I have a one-word answer. I've tried to use it in my book. Enforcement. If the UK was to finally enforce its anti-money laundering laws. Just recently, a very major British bank was fined by the authorities for money laundering. The size of the fine was pathetic. The top executives of that bank take home more combined than the total fine in their personal income. I mean, it's ridiculous. There has to be enforcement. If we could see across the world governments that pledge to do things at the Summit for America actually being seen to enforce their anti-corruption laws. I remember once a conversation at a seminar in Buenos Aires with an Argentinian lawyer who told me they had a mountain of anti-corruption laws, but of course, none of them were enforced. So it's not fundamentally a question of more and more and more laws, although we do need some, of course, in the UK and elsewhere. But we have to be, governments have to be seen to be enforcing. If they're not, those pledges have a hollow ring.
You mentioned Ukraine there. I don't know if you've seen any of this being reported, but I've been really struck recently by some of the messaging coming out of the US about Western allies and their action on dirty money. There was recently an article in the Times that said that American officials were really concerned that any sanctions they impose if Russia invades Ukraine might be ineffective and effectively kind of undermined by the fact that Britain has hosted dirty money in London for years, and they feel there's a complacency there. My question to you, kind of what's going on with Russia at the moment? Do you think this marks a changing point among Western allies and the pressure they apply to each other in the fight against corruption, and how important is that?
I think we'll have to see, but I think we should be skeptical. I'll give you two examples. First of all, just this week, Gazprom announced that former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder is to become a director of Gazprom. He's already a director of Nord Stream and of Rosneft. He has publicly come out and supported Putin against Ukraine. And I haven't seen any great condemnation in the British press, for example, about Schröder. And even in Germany, the Social Democratic Party, of which he's a member, is divided in condemning him. He's an enabler. Where's the outrage about that? That's just one example. That makes me skeptical about some aspects of sanctions. But I'd like to take you back to February 2018, to Salisbury, to an attempted assassination by Russian intelligence officers on former spy Skripal and his daughter Yulia. And then a month later, in the House of Commons, Prime Minister May, then in office, announced we were going to get tough on Russians in the UK. We're going to throw out 23 Russian diplomats in reprisals for what happened there in Salisbury. We're going to get tough. And the very same day, March 14th, 2018, Gazprom raised £400 million on the London Stock Exchange in a bond deal, and nobody said anything. A couple of months later, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons actually said that particular deal underscored the hollowness of Mrs. May's rhetoric. So where are we now? We'll have to see if the sanctions are serious. Will the British government stop all British financial institutions and ones that are based in London from dealing in the shares of major companies which are owned by Russians that are on the London Stock Exchange? Let's just start there. I doubt it. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think the UK has taken some really positive and significant steps forward in the fight against corruption in the last 10 years, but there are some big loopholes that still exist within the infrastructure. And I think Samar in the chat mentioned Companies House and the problems we have there. Can you tell us about any kind of positive examples from elsewhere around the world where loopholes have been closed? Is there anything that we should be learning from here in the UK?
I wish I could. I could point to increased fines here. I could point to the literally hundreds of people who've now been sanctioned over the last 6 years in the US. All of that, however, bottom line, hasn't made enough difference. We have not seen the sanction systems on Russia, just to take Russia as one major case. We haven't seen all the sanctions deterring President Putin from the actions that we now see him taking on Ukraine. He somehow has been able to manage the sanctions. His cronies, so many of the oligarchs, have managed to get around the sanctions in different ways. Even though they've been heavily sanctioned in the US, they've still found other ways to continue doing their business, from their Luxembourg holding companies to even the holding companies in the UK, a couple of which at least are chaired by members of the House of Lords. We're allowing their frontmen, these enablers, to get away with it. And we have to be much tougher. So yes, you could find a few isolated great actions, but they don't. We need to look at the totality and to be very worried about our democracy and our security as a result.
In the last chapter of your book, you reference what's known as democratic decline, waning trust in politicians. Do you think there is anything that politicians around the world can be doing to regain that trust? Or what do you think they should be doing?
You know, I end the book, thank you for the question. I end the book with a quote from former Congressman John Lewis in the United States. John Lewis was one of the great leaders of the civil rights movement. And in answer to your question, I'm going to read you the quote I have from John Lewis in the book, if I may. He says, "Some people have told me that I'm a rare bird in the blue sky of dreamers. I believe innocently and profoundly as a child that the world could be a better place. I have survived the worst aggression, all the attacks mounted against dreamers to stamp out the light that they see. I've been rejected, hated, oppressed, beaten, jailed, and I've almost died only to live another day. I've witnessed betrayal, corruption, bombing, lunacy, conspiracy, and even assassination, and I've still kept marching on." And when you hear people like Congressman Jamie Raskin in the US Congress today, who is on the January 6th commission, which is looking into the horrendous riots that took place a year ago, talk about democracy. And they talk openly and publicly and emotionally like John Lewis. And they keep marching on in the belief that freedom really matters. And I would love to see politicians in many more countries go to their constituents and talk about the value of freedom and why we cannot allow this authoritarian rise and why we need to clamp down on the enablers and corruption, because they are supporting and feeding anti-freedom, anti-democratic trends in the world today.
Absolutely.
There's an emotional answer.
Well, it's an emotional subject. We've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to kick off with one from Samar Pratt at Exeter. She's a managing director at Exeter. And she says, you know, fighting financial crime is complex. For Exeter's clients, it goes beyond simply interpreting government policy and implementing policies and procedures. It involves establishing preventative and mitigated controls and then actively monitoring these controls to ensure they remain fit for purpose. And her question is, kind of in your view, why should companies in the corporate sector, so banks, multinational corporations, etc., you know, what should they be doing more of or better to leverage data and technology to root out and prevent corruption facilitated by professional enablers?
It's a great question, and it goes to compliance. And I say very clearly in the book, ticking the boxes is not enough. You can have the best technologies, but if the tone at the top of the company isn't the right one, then it's not going to have much effect. I spoke to a huge conference a few years ago of compliance officers. And I happened to mention that they didn't seem to get the respect in their institutions that they deserved. And to my amazing surprise, I got a standing ovation immediately, spontaneous, when I said that. And I asked them afterwards, and they said, look, the people at the top of our institution have all this compliance investments because the law says they should, the regulators say they should, but we don't see them believing in it. And when you get Just give you one example. When Goldman Sachs paid a bribe of $1.5 billion to people in Malaysia and around the former Prime Minister of Malaysia in order to win bond issue contracts and potentially other big deals, and then floated $6 billion of bonds, of which $4.5 billion was stolen. Are you telling me that a compliance officer in the middle of Goldman Sachs could have done anything about it? They had red flags. And the top management, of course, they knew about it. After all, look at the size of the deal. So the tone at the top is absolutely crucial. And I would say to our friends at Exeter, look at that first. Look at the culture. When I talk in the book about changing banking culture and changing other cultures, Jean-Claude Trichet, the former head of the European Central Bank, after the financial crisis a decade ago, came out with a very good set of proposals for changing the paradigm in banking and in finance in order to change the culture. There have been numerous others who have said the same thing. We just can't have this current system where paying fines is just the cost of doing business. So we'll take excessive risk.
Yeah, I'm getting applauded in the chat for your answers, Frank. We have one from Euan Grant. Euan is a former UK law enforcement intelligence analyst. And Euan says, what should be done when some kleptocrats are key allies of the West in this new era of great power competition? So kleptocrats who are actually allies of kind of Western powers, is there anything that can be done about that, and what do you think should be done?
It comes down to values, doesn't it? Let's go to the extreme. The largest purchaser of American arms is Saudi Arabia. After the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, Donald Trump rather brazenly said, well, they buy our arms. That's important. What more do you want to say? Look at Egypt. There are more journalists in prison in Egypt today than in any country outside of China, Russia, and possibly Turkey. They are sort of neck and neck with Turkey. It's horrendous. And yet, the US sees Egypt as a very important strategic partner in the Middle East. And so it continues to provide Egypt with a huge amount of aid every year. This year, they reduced the amount by 130 million because of Egypt's human rights violations, but they still gave them another 800 million. We have to get our values right. If we keep on, as Western powers, putting arms sales over and above issues of corruption and values, in the end, we will lose and the authoritarians will gain. Tough choices.
Yeah, another tough choice. David Newsbaum asks, are we better to start by focusing on the most egregious cases or on those where we think progress and change is most likely to be possible? Should we be going for the low-hanging fruit?
The importance of some of the biggest cases over the years, and ones that I've noted in the book, whether it be the outrageous money laundering for the former president of Sudan by BNP Paribas at the very time of the Darfur genocide, whether it be the Goldman Sachs case in Malaysia very recently, whether it be HSBC's numerous cases or Deutsche Bank's numerous cases. Why are these important? Because they're high profile, because they send a message throughout the industry. If we don't attack at the top, then we will find ourselves getting further and further behind. So we have to do both. We have to have systemic reform, and I mentioned some of the suggestions earlier, but at the same time, we dare not shirk from going after the top people. And the idea that the CEO, the chairman of a bank, doesn't even lose his job when the bank pays huge amounts in fines for money laundering, for example, or corruption. This is absurd. This is crazy, I think. Do you agree?
Yeah, more needs to be done. Huguette Labelle has raised her hand, I think, and wants to come in. I don't know, Huguette, if you have a question or if you wanted to make a comment, but you're very welcome to speak. If Kerry wants to bring her in.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Huguette.
Yes, sorry. Frank, this book is just exceptional. I keep, having read it a few times, I keep it as a source of very important information as I get ready to make various statements. I have two questions, and they deal, in a sense, with the other side of the coin. Of course, if the governments, the national authorities, do not change their way of behaving, as you've been saying this morning and before, of course, we won't get very far. But do you think that the standard setters, especially in law, in accounting, could be strongly encouraged to play a very different role with their members? I'm thinking, for example, the International Law Association. It's their 150th anniversary next year, and they are, they will be publishing a series of papers, including one on fighting corruption, but that's not enough. I'm thinking more of them dealing with their responsibility as standard setters. My second one deals with stock exchanges. You raised that point earlier. What is it that we could, that the stock exchange authorities could really include in their responsibility, something very different to try to deal with all the money laundering and that's taking place around the world? Thank you, Frank, for all your work.
Thank you, Huguette. For those who don't know, Huguette Labelle has been a passionate leader in anti-corruption around the world. She was the chair of Transparency International for a number of years, and she comes to us today from Ottawa in Canada. And it's wonderful to hear from you, Huguette. And of course, you ask very tough questions. Lawyers are at the center of the whole enabling fraternity. And I quote in the book this story from an investigation that Global Witness did a few years ago, where they sent somebody undercover to talk to a whole series of New York law firms and the senior partners in those firms, and suggest that would those firms be helpful in helping an unnamed African kleptocrat from laundering his money into the US. And of the 13 firms that were interviewed, one firm said, "We don't deal with that business, let's end the conversation." The other 12 entered the conversation, and one even said, a good lawyer knows the law, a very good lawyer knows the judge. I think you should start there. I think the legal profession and the associations of law that are involved with it should be right out front calling for much higher standards on beneficial ownership. They should be right out front in talking about due diligence. They should be right out front in pushing all sorts of higher standards and norms to prevent the enablers from operating. It's in their interest, and if they want public respect, they have to do it. And the same for the stock exchanges. The stock exchanges should not be there to be basically bought by the highest bidder. What on earth is the London Stock Exchange doing, for example, by listing Gazprom? People across Western continental Europe are paying exorbitant prices for natural gas right now because of the political programs pursued by Putin and Gazprom. And what's the London Stock Exchange doing? Probably throwing a party for this listed company called Gazprom. we've got to get our values in order across the board. And these institutions like law societies, like associations of lawyers, like associations of stock exchanges, have to raise the bar, not just on their rhetoric, but their actions. Thanks, Euan.
We have a good question from Mark Moody Stewart. He asks, are there any good examples of governments returning funds to the countries from which they were stolen that you can think of? For example, assets confiscated in France from Teodoro Obiang to Equatorial Guinea.
Well, Mark Moody Stewart is just another one of these enormous heroes and pioneers in anti-corruption. His late brother was a founder of TIUK. And so good to hear from him. Thank you. We've done a terrible job on repatriation of stolen assets. When you think that by many estimates, something like $2 trillion in dirty money flows through the financial system every year, then the amount that's actually been repatriated is absolutely minuscule. I remember a session once where a Swiss banker stood up at a conference and said to a Nigerian investigator who was on the platform, he said, "We have repatriated $800 million of the money stolen by the Obacha regime," which Mark Moody Stewart talks about. And the Nigerian on the platform said, "Yes, and where's the other several billion dollars that you're still holding?" The legal system, the banking system are all designed to protect these stolen assets. That's wrong. And great initiatives like the STAR initiative at the World Bank and the UN and others have just not been able to get the money back, and it should go back to the victims.
We have a question from Paneet Bola. How do you tackle corruption when media and journalist freedoms are being constrained? And there was another question around slap suits, which we're certainly seeing in the UK. We're seeing individual journalists targeted by legal action when they try and raise concerns about individuals, when they name names. How much of a problem do you think that is, and what can be done?
Well, it's terrible in the UK. I mean, my book, I'd hoped my book would be published by a British publisher. So here's the book. But one British publisher wrote back and he said, "Look, we're too worried about the libel costs and the legal costs, so we're not going to do it." One of the really important initiatives that was announced at the Summit for Democracy by the US Aid Administrator Samantha Power, who was in the Obama administration, the United Nations ambassador, was to do much more to protect civil society space and to protect investigative journalists around the world. It's key. If we don't have much greater protections for whistleblowers, let me include that, for investigative journalism and for civil society activists everywhere, we're never going to get to the bottom of the fundamental corruption issue. Obviously, you have to start in the home countries where the corruption is being so perpetrated. And here, those forces are so vital. We have to support them. It's terrible. Look how many people have been in prison, civil society and journalists in Turkey, a country where we are constantly in the West, in the US, in the UK, doing an enormous amount of business. Who at the highest levels of our government is saying to President Erdogan, "Stop this unbelievable harassment of the press and civil society"? It's just not being said enough or loudly enough. And yet it is crucial. Yep, it's absolutely at the core of what we're trying to do and what I hope to try to bring forward in this book.
Yeah, I can certainly say from an NGO perspective, it's a problem that we face on a regular basis as well, and have to be very mindful of. We have another question which kind of goes back to your comments on enforcement. And this question says, the UK keeps passing laws which are not properly implemented. are there any countries in the free world which are actually putting in place and using robust systems for fighting back against the enablers? And how did they get there?
Hope springs eternal. There is a tiny country in Europe called Moldova. And about a year and a half ago, to the surprise of many, in an election, a woman became president, President Sanau, who appointed another woman as prime minister. And the two of them are dedicated to anti-corruption work. They have a huge task. The president says, you know, the banks rob the country dry. We have to find a way to deal with that. At the same time, they got the Russians not only on the border, but in the country, in a very, very delicate and difficult situation. She's courageous. She's trying to do the right thing. We've just, in the Partnership for Transparency Fund, we've just been doing a really big training program with civil society in Moldova on public procurement monitoring. So that's a tiny example. The Zondo Commission in South Africa is amazing. They have detailed in the first two reports enormous amount of hard facts that I'm sure will lead to prosecutions of individuals related to the state capture systems of former President Zuma. I think that's really important. But to put this in perspective, the US Justice Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US do more to prosecute anti-corruption under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and more against money laundering than all of West European authorities combined. And yet, unquestionably, the amount that the US authorities do is a tiny fraction of what they should be doing. So let's not rejoice at great success stories. We can point to many efforts, but we need to sustain it. And it has to come from the US, it has to come from the UK, it has to come from the EU. It's great to see the progress in Moldova, but that president needs the support, the strong support of the major Western powers. And so far, it isn't forthcoming. Hopefully my book will change that.
That would be very welcome. We've got a question harking back to some of your comments on fines. Are the pitiful fines and lack of criminal penalties a result of the prosecutors not seeking tougher penalties, or are there limits within the law in terms of how, I think maybe you touched on this earlier, in terms of kind of how big fines can be? And I'm also interested to hear your thoughts on, I don't know if you know much about corporate criminal liability laws. So laws that basically introduce a failure to prevent offence when it comes to big corporate firms engaging in money laundering.
I have a very specific proposal in my book that and it goes to, I think, the core of this issue. I don't believe that, look, in various cases, there's a Credit Suisse bond deal with Mozambique. Senior executives have been prosecuted. In the Goldman Sachs case, a couple of executives have been prosecuted. But the top people, the chairman, the CEOs, these are never prosecuted. Now, 20 years ago, there was the Enron scandal. And Enron and WorldCom and other giant American companies were caught to be cooking the books to boost their share price in outrageous fraud. As a result of that, in the US Congress, a law was passed, it was called the Sarbanes-Oxley law, that said that the CEO of a company, or the chairman, depending a little bit, in many American companies, they're the same person, has to sign off on the annual financial statements. And that if it turns out that those financial statements were wrong, that fraud was perpetrated, then the CEO chairman could be held criminally liable and could be criminally prosecuted. I would like to see every large corporation, bank, manufacturing company, exporting company, face a law that says that the CEO chairman has to sign an annual statement stating that, to the best of his knowledge, there has been no violation of corruption laws and of anti-money laundering laws by the company in the previous 12 months. And that if it turns out that that is not the case, then that person could be held criminally liable. Let's make it force it down onto the individual. So I'm not asking very much. This is basically a minor change in corporate law. Why not do it?
We certainly see in the UK, people at the top of corporations are often actually protected from a lot of this activity, so they can't be prosecuted in court.
Well, that's why I want them. That's why I want them to sign, because let's end their impunity. We always talk about impunity for kleptocrats. Let's end the impunity for corporate chairmen. Instead of giving them knighthoods and putting them in the House of Lords, which is what the UK does. And I give examples in my book of exactly that. Sorry, Rich.
No, yeah, brilliant. We have probably time for one more question from the floor, and this is from Sergey. I think it's a really interesting question. He says, would you say it is high time decision makers, law enforcement agencies, and civil society, like probably a lot of people on this call, alike, revise their go-to anti-corruption approach, which for many years has relied on building stronger anti-corruption institutions and passing good laws? Perhaps it is time for a different way to approach anti-corruption on both global and national levels. If not, why? If yes, how?
Well, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book. And I tried to talk about this right at the beginning. Not enough activists, not enough governments view these issues that we've been talking about today in national security terms. The only way that beneficial ownership laws were passed, a law was passed in the US last year, was because Republicans and Democrats came together to see this as a national security issue. And so the Corporate Transparency Act that was passed was part of the National Defense Authorization Law. I think that we have to elevate the whole discussion to one about the threats to democracy and threats to national security. If we keep on talking about this as an ethical issue alone, or a moral issue, a humanitarian issue, or a financial issue alone, we are not going to have the political traction needed to really push this forward. And I think it's time that we did that. Now, you at TI UK have this wonderful department in your organization dealing with defense and security. I think every anti-corruption group should put defense and security right there at the heart of a lot of what they're doing and appeal to a much wider audience to get support for the actions that are necessary. You only do that, I think, when you talk politics, and that means democracy, it means freedom, and it means our own security. And let me just say this, I'm very passionate about this because I was born in England. I live in the United States, but I was born in England. My parents were very fortunate to be refugees from the Nazis who were taken in by the British. They understood what escaping fascism and kleptocracy was all about. They understood the value of freedom. And I think we need to put that at the core of our arguments against corruption. If we do, we will get far greater political support. So thank you for that question.
Just quickly before we wrap up, I think it's probably good to end on an optimistic note. And I'm interested, Frank, in what gives you hope? What is there hope in all of this, and what gives you hope that these things will be addressed in the future and that change might be coming?
Thank you. The hope comes from a younger generation. Comes when I look at you, when I look at Duncan, when I think of many of the people on this call at this event, who travel much more, who see firsthand the protests of highly courageous people in Belarus, in Sudan, in Turkey, in many countries today, more public protests against corrupt regimes, authoritarian regimes, than ever before. They are showing enormous courage. I think they deeply understand what's at stake, and they're willing to risk everything to bring about change and openness and freedom. I look at the two magnificent people who won the Nobel Peace Prize in December, a Filipino journalist, a Russian journalist, and listen to their speeches about freedom. That gives me hope. Because so long as there are so many and increasing numbers of younger people getting out there, marching for freedom, talking about freedom, risking everything for freedom and for democracy and openness, then I think the cause of anti-corruption has a very bright future. But the risks are enormous to these individuals, and therefore they deserve the greatest possible support. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for helping to bring my book to a wide and very, very important audience. But most important, thank you for the fabulous work that TI UK does. Keep marching on, as John Lewis would say.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating, Frank, and I would encourage everyone in attendance to buy Frank's book to find out more. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions today. We had limited time. I think there'll be a survey sent round. We really want to know how we can do these events better. Please do let us